Chapter 11 of Joan Thursday by Louis Joseph Vance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. For several days the girl had haunted the stairs, the hall, and doorstep, alert to waylay Matthias, before suddenly she became aware that it was long since she had either caught a glimpse of him or heard the syncopated murmuring of the typewriter behind the closed door to his back parlor. It required the lapse of another day or two before she found courage to question with labored indifference the dilapidated chambermaid who sedulously neglected her room for lack of a tip. From this far from garrulous source she learned that Matthias had packed up and gone out of town very suddenly, without mentioning where he might be addressed during his absence. Alone at the window of her tiny cell, Joan stared down at the uninspiring vista of back yards and disconsolately recapitulated her sorry fortunes. She was now close upon the end of the fortnight's residence in the hall bedroom. Before long she would have to surrender another $4, a week's rent in advance. Of the $22 she had received from Butch, 8 remained in her purse. By dint of adhering to a diet largely vegetarian, she had managed without serious discomfort to keep within an expenditure of $4 per week for food. And twice Maizie Dean had saved her the cost of an evening meal by inviting her to dine out, at the expense of friends in the profession. But a continuance of such favors was not to be counted upon, and the problem of living a fourth week away from home was one serious and importunate, always assuming she should fail to secure work before her money ran out. She had no resources in any degree dependable. Butch, even if willing, would probably not be able to extend her another loan. She possessed nothing worth pawning, and Maizie Dean had taken prompt occasion to make it clear that, while she was willing to do anything inexpensive for a budding sister artiste, her tolerance would stop short of financial aid. "Take it from me, dear," she announced soon after their first meeting, "there ain't no people in the world quicker to slip you a live tip than folks in the business. But you've gotta make up your mind to pay your own keep. They work too hard for their coin to give up any without a howl you could hear from here to Holland. And anyway, everybody's always broke in the summer. If you don't land somewhere before your cash runs low, you might just as well make up your mind to slip back into the chain gang behind the counter." She had developed or changed amazingly in the brief period of her public career. Joan experienced difficulty in recognizing in her the warm-hearted Irish girl who had initiated her into the duties of saleswoman in the stocking department. She had hardened more than superficially. She was now as artificial as her make-up, as the hue of her ashen hair. The world to her was a desert threaded by circuits, life an arid waste of open time, punctuated with oases of booking, and the fountainhead of temporal power was located in the innermost sanctum of the United Booking Offices. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she crossed her knees frankly, sucked thoughtfully at a cigarette, and waved an explanatory hand. "Here's me and Mame, thinking we was all fixed for the next 6 weeks, and then something puts a crimp into our booking, and we're out for God knows long, till next fall, sure. That's unless we want to take a trip over the meal ticket circuit, filling in between fillums, you know. And if we do that, it's going to crab us with the Orpheum people, sure. We'd never get back into the real money class. So we gotta hold on to what little we got until we can see more time headed our way." On the other hand, she had been liberal with sage and trustworthy counsel as to the best way to go about breaking into the game. It was thanks to her that Joan was now able to enter a theatrical employment agency without fear and trembling, and to back her application for chorus work with a glib and unblushing statement that she had had "experience" in summer stock out on the coast. And to the Sisters Dean, likewise, Joan owed her growing acquaintance with the intricate geography of the theatrical districts of New York, her ability to discriminate between players resting, and the average run of Broadway loungers who cluttered the shady side of that thoroughfare from 25th Street north to 47th, those shimmering summer afternoons, and her slowly widening circle of nodding acquaintances among the lesser peoples of the vaudeville world. As a rule, she was awake before anybody else in the establishment of Madame Duprat. Not yet could she slough the habit of early rising. Her breakfast she was accustomed to get at the same dairy restaurant which had supplied her first meal away from home, and at the same moderate expense, 10 cents. By 10 o'clock she would be on Broadway, beginning her round of the agencies, a courageous, shabby figure in the withering sun blast, patient and indomitable through long hours of waiting in crowded anterooms, undiscouraged by the brevity and fruitlessness of the interviews with which her persistence was sometimes rewarded, ignoring disappointment with the same studied calm with which she had long since learned to ignore the advances of loafers of the streets. Her lunches she would purchase wherever she might happen to be at the noon hour, or go without. By 5 o'clock at the latest, frequently much earlier, she would turn back to West 45th Street. For dinner she sought again the establishment that provided her breakfast. Her idle hours, both day and evening, she grew accustomed to waste in the double bedroom, second floor front, occupied by the dancing Deans. At such times the soi-disant sisters were rarely without company. They were lively and agreeable creatures, by no means unattractive, and so thoroughly theatric in every effect of manner, speech, gesture, person, and thought, that the most case-hardened member of the profession could not but feel at home in their company. Consequently they were popular with both sexes of their associates. Seldom did a day pass but they entertained several callers, with all of whom they seemed to be on terms of the most candid intimacy. So Joan grew accustomed to being hailed, whenever she opened the door of the sisters' room, with a formula that varied little with repetition. "Why, if it ain't the kid! Hello, dearie, come right in and stop a while. Say, listen, I want you to shake hands with my friend, Charlie Quard. I guess you know who Charlie is, all right. You must have seen him often. Played leading juveniles with the Spangler stock, I don't know how long. Charlie, this is my little friend, Miss Thursday." "In the business, I trust?" "Going to be, before long. Just looking round." "Well, I wish you luck, Miss Thursday. This is the rottenest season I ever struck. There's 80 people for every job that blooms. Why, you know, Maizie, I was talking only yesterday to Percy Williams, and Percy said—" At about this point Joan would ordinarily be forgotten, and the gossip would rattle on through a stifling cloud of cigarette smoke, while she sat and listened with grave, if not always comprehending, attention. And in this manner she met and grew familiar with the personalities of an astonishing crew of minor vaudeville folk: jugglers, dancers, patter comedians, balladists, coon shouters, performers on weird musical instruments, monologists, and an unclassified host of others, including a liberal sprinkling of plain actors and actresses, the pendulums of whose life alternated between small parts in popular price stock companies and smaller parts in so-called dramatic sketches presented in vaudeville houses. To them all, if they remembered her at all, she was Joan Thursday. The translation from Thursby had been almost inevitable. Thursday was by far the easier word to remember. Joan soon grew tired of correcting the friends of the dancing Deans, and accepted the change the more readily since it provided her with a real stage name, and so, in some measure, identified her with the business to which her every aspiration was devoted. Of all the population of this new world, perhaps the most prominent in their eyes, aside from these saltatory sisters, was Mr. Quard, or, to give him the fullest benefit of the printed cards which, detaching them dexterously from the perforated edges by which they were held in an imitation leather cover, he distributed regardless of expense: Mr. Charles Harborough Quard, Spangler Stock Company, Variety Artists Club, Brooklyn, New York. He was a long, rangy animal, robustious, romantical, with a taste in the question of personal decoration that created compelling effects. His face was large, open, boldly featured, his smile genial, his laugh constant and unctuous. Something less than 30, he had been on the stage since childhood, with the training of an actor of the old school. He combined immense vitality, an ample, dashing air, enviable self-sufficiency, the temperament of a tomcat. Any competent stage director could have made much of him, but in an age when managers cast their productions with types who look their parts in preference to players who can act them, he found few chances to demonstrate his ability outside the cheaper stock organizations. For the only character he was physically fitted to portray was that of an actor. An ill-starred impulse had led him to resign his latest stock connection in order to adventure in vaudeville with a one-act sketch written to his order by a hack manufacturer of such trash. Its try-out week in a provincial town had elicited no offers from other managers, and in the meantime his place in the stock company had been filled. At present he had a little money saved up, no immediate prospects of an engagement, good humour, no illusions whatever. "It's no good," he informed Miss May Dean on the occasion of their first meeting. "I know where I get off, all right. I can play anything they slip me. But these Broadway guys can't see my kind of actor. Give me a part I can sink my teeth into, and I'll shake it until the house climbs on the seats and howls. But that ain't what they're after, these days." "The movies'll get you, if you don't watch out," May suggested cheerfully. "That's right, and I'd be a knockout in a film gang, too. I'm just their kind. That's what's become of all the old boys who still think 14th Street's the Rialto, you know. But me, I'm too strong for the noise an audience makes when they like you, or don't. I'd just as lief be hissed as get every hand in the house. Don't believe I could stand acting for a one-eyed box that didn't say anything but clickety-click. I'd rather travel with the Uncle Tommers. Honest." He was publicly morose for a moment or two. Then he roused. "Cheer up. The worst is yet to come. Maybe I can stick out till next spring, when Grady makes his next all-star revival. Wonder what he'll exhume this time. If it's only something like The Silver King or East Lynne, I may yet cop out a chance to play to a $2 house. Now listen, I'm going down on the stoop and smoke a cigarette while you girls color your maps for artificial light. The eats are on me tonight." "Does that take in my little friend?" demanded Maizie, with a nod toward Joan. Quard threw Joan a kindly glance. "Sure. Now get a hustle on." "But I can't," Joan protested. "I'm sorry. I'd love to, but I've got nothing fit to wear." "You look pretty good to me as you stand," returned Quard. "Forget it, kid, and kick in." "That's right," Maizie insisted. "Besides, I'll lend you a hat and a fresh fichu. You don't need any coat tonight. It's too rotten warm." "Anyway," Quard said over his shoulder as he left the room, "we ain't booked for Sherry's." In witness whereof, he introduced the girls to an obscure Italian boarding house in 27th Street, the proprietress of which admitted them only after examination through a grill in the front door. Quard explained to Joan that this precaution was necessary because the house served red ink with the meals, and without benefit of a liquor license. Hence only friends could be admitted. They dined by gaslight in the back yard, under an awning which served the double purpose of excluding observation from the neighbouring dwellings, and compressing the heated air. Perhaps 24 tables crowded the enclosure. The male guests by common consent removed their coats and hung them on nails in the fence. The ladies emulated by discarding hats and all conventionalities of a nature to impede free expression of their temperaments. Maizie Dean even did without her English accent. The meal was of a sort only to be consumed with impunity by optimists and Italians. A heavy soup, and all one could eat of it, spaghetti without end. a minute section of lukewarm blotting paper with a remote flavor of chicken, a salad, cheese and coffee, a half bottle of atrocious red wine. Joan enjoyed it immensely. It has been said that her powers of digestion were exceptional. Everybody seemed to know everybody else. Conversation was free between tables. Personalities were bandied back and forth amid intense glee. Quard, consuming enormous quantities of wine, proved himself a general favourite, a leading spirit. After dinner he called for a virulent green cordial, which Joan tasted but could not drink, and later returned to the wine. Before the end of the evening he became semi-maudlin, and on leaving exploited a highly humorous inability to walk a straight line. On the corner of Broadway he halted suddenly, bade the three women a slurred good night, and without other ceremony swung himself aboard a Broadway car. His rudeness excited no comment from the dancing Deans. They walked all the way home with Joan unescorted. Joan was surprised to see by the clock in the Herald building that it was almost 11. She thought she had never known an evening to pass so quickly and so pleasantly. What little wine she had consumed seemed to have affected her not at all, beyond rendering her keenly appreciative of this novel experience. But she suffered the next morning from a slight and, to her, inexplicable headache. It was 4 or 5 days later before she saw Quard again. He called early in the evening, but after dinner, and sat chatting amiably with the women for upwards of an hour before the real purpose of his visit transpired. "I was talking to Reinhardt about an idea I got for a sketch, day before yesterday," he announced suddenly. "But he wanted 50 cash before he'd touch it, and seeing as it was him slipped me that other lemon, I told him merrily where he could go and went home and wrote it myself." "You didn't!" Maizie exclaimed admiringly. "You bet your life I did," the actor asseverated with conscious modesty. "Why not? It's no great stunt, writing, and besides it's all old junk I've done before, only hashed up a new way. All I had to do was to cop lines out of shows I've played in. Surefire stuff, you know, and write in names of characters. That's nothing." "Oh, no, nothing at all," commented May Dean from her perch on the window sill. "What's an author, anyway? 8 to 5, girls. He's got the script on him. Get ready to duck." "Well," Quard laughed, "you beat me to it, all right." He produced a sheaf of folded papers, smoothing them out upon his knee. "I just thought I'd see what you thought of it. If it's any good, I'm going to read it to Schneider tomorrow, and see what he'll offer me." "Who's Schneider?" Maizie asked blankly. "Agent for the film circuits," Quard replied. "You don't mean you're thinking of falling for the 4 a day?" "I'll try anything once. I'm not too proud to earn my bed and board in the dull season, anyhow. Besides, this thing would break into the Orpheum circuit only over the dead body of Martin Beck. I'm no Georgie Cohan. But it ought to sandwich in between the pictures without anybody asking his 10 cents back." "You've got your nerve with you," Maizie commented darkly. "Let him rave," May advised, exhaling cigarette smoke voluminously. "Shoot." Taking this for consent, Quard rattled the sheets of paper, tilted back his chair, and began to read. His voice was flexible and sonorous. Instinctively he declaimed the lines, extracting from each its full value. Now and again he lent emphasis to a phrase with an eloquent hand. But to Joan the composition was quite incoherent. She attended with wonder, and a feeling of impatience because of her inability to understand what Quard seemed to relish with so much enthusiasm. It was, in fact, a worthless farrago of nonsense. None the less the two dancers laughed at encouraging intervals. Flattered, Quard rose, removed his coat and began to act the lines, striding up and down the narrow space between the foot of the double bed and the marble mantelpiece. The night was hot. A single gas jet illumined the center of the room. Quard perspired freely. For all that, his stenographic acting gave the thing some slight accent of humanity. It became a trifle, a mere trifle, more intelligible. Seated on the window sill, en profile to the room, her slight, wiry body attired sketchily in a kimono and short skirt. May Dean swung her legs and stared out into the darkness, an ironic smile hovering round her thin lips. Maizie lounged on the bed, tracing a meaningless pattern on the counterpane with a thin and rouge-stained forefinger. Joan occupied the only chair other than that at the disposal of the actor. She was very tired, and her attention wandered, even though Quard managed to draw it back now and then by some vivid trick of elocution or gesture. Vaguely sensitive to the magnetism of the man, her thoughts were occupied more with indefinite speculations about his personality than with the semi-plagiaristic and wholly commonplace concoction of cheap sentiment and tried and true gags which he professed to have written. Physically, he attracted her. Divested of his coat, his chest swelled impressively beneath a pink-striped silk shirt. When he lifted an arm, the clinging sleeve moulded itself to an admirable biceps. As he strode to and fro, the stuff of his thin summer trousers shaped itself to legs that might have proved enviable to Sir Willoughby Patterne himself. His wide-lipped mouth disclosed an excellent outfit of large, white, strong teeth. His jet-black hair curled engagingly at his temples and over his generous pink ears. She liked his big, muscular, mobile hands. She started suddenly to discover that he had concluded and was facing her with an expectant expression, and sat up and smiled, faintly, with embarrassment, trying to remember what it had all been about. From the window, May Dean drawled languidly: "Is that the finish?" Quard waved an arm. "Curtain," he said, and sat down. "My God!" observed May thoughtfully. He laughed uncomfortably. "As bad as all that?" "It'd make a wonderful chaser," Maizie commented without lifting her eyes from the counterpane. Quard turned desperately back to Joan. "What do you think of it, Miss Thursday?" "I think so, too," she said with all the animation she could muster. The other women laughed aloud. She flushed and added: "I mean I think it's wonderful. I don't know what a chaser is." "A chaser, dearie," Maizie explained in tones of acute commiseration, "is an act put on in the continuous houses to chase out the chair warmers and make room for more." "Well," said Quard, shuffling the manuscript, "I don't care if it is a chaser, so long as it stakes me to the eats till something else turns up." Chapter 12 of Joan Thursday by Louis Joseph Vance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. On that day when she discovered the disappearance of John Matthias, Joan left the house later than had been her wont, and returned earlier, after a faint-hearted and abortive attempt to interview the stage manager of a new musical production then being assembled to rehearse against an early opening in the autumn. The Deans were out. She had no place to go other than to her bare and lonely room, and she felt uncommonly helpless and friendless. Subconsciously, she had been holding in reserve, as a last hope, an appeal to the generosity of Matthias. He was a playwright, an intimate of managers. Surely he would be able to suggest something, no matter how poorly paid or inconspicuous. Now, with the date of his return indefinite, she felt unjustly bereft of that last resource. She spent 2 weary, wretched hours on her bed, harassed by a singularly fresh and clear perception of her unfitness, for the first time made conscious that she had actually possessed no reasonable excuse for her determination to go on the stage. Her qualifications, which hitherto might have been expressed, according to her own estimate, by the algebraic X, now assumed a value only to be indicated by a cipher. She had a good, strong voice, it's true, but no ear whatever for music. She didn't know steps, Maizie's term, denoting ability for eccentric dancing, and of the art of acting she was completely ignorant. In fact, Her theatrical ambitions had been founded more upon need of money than upon any real or fancied passion for the stage. Other girls had done likewise and bettered themselves. Joan knew no reason why she should fall short of their enviable achievements. But she was innocent of dramatic feeling and even of any real yearning for applause. Only her looks, of which she was confident, were to be counted upon to carry her beyond the stage doors. She thought of her home, of her mother, her father, Edna and Butch, with a dull and temperate regret. Since that first afternoon she had never attempted to revisit them, and she felt now no inclination toward returning. Still her thoughts yearned back to the miserable flat as to an assured shelter. There, at least, she had been safe from rude weather and positive hunger. As things were with her, another week would find her destitute, but there was still the chance that something would turn up within that week. She felt almost sure that something would turn up. In this incurable optimism resided almost her sole endowment for the career of an actress: this, and a certain dogged temper which wouldn't permit her to acknowledge defeat until every possible expedient had been explored. Toward evening she heard footsteps on the stairs. To her surprise they paused by her door, upon which fell a confident knock. Jumping up from her bed in a flurry, she answered to find Quard on the threshold. No one had been farther from her thoughts. She stared, agape and speechless. "Hello, Miss Thursday," said the actor genially. "Can I come in?" He entered, cast a comprehensive glance round the poor little room, deposited his hat upon the bed and himself beside it, leaving the door open and murmuring some inarticulate response. Joan turned back to her one chair. "Hope I don't intrude," Quard rattled on cheerfully. "The girl told me the Dean's was out and you in, so I took a chance and said I'd come right up." "I'm sorry Maizie isn't home," stammered the girl. "I ain't." Quard's eyes looked her over with open admiration. "I didn't want to see either of 'em, really. What I wanted was a little confab with you." "With me?" "Surest thing you know. I want to talk business. I don't guess you've landed anything yet?" Joan shook her head blankly. "Well, I got a little proposition to make you. You know that sketch I wrote and you liked so much the other night?" "Yes." "Well, I got hold of Schneider yesterday and read it to him, and he says he can get me 4 or 5 weeks' booking at least, if I can put it over at the try out. How does that strike you?" "Why, I'm glad," Joan faltered, still mystified. "It must be fun to get something to do." "Well, I haven't got it yet, and of course maybe I won't get it. One of the first things you got to learn in this business is: never spend your pay envelope till you got it in your mitt. And in this case a lot depends on you." "I don't get you," Joan returned frankly. "What have I got to do with it?" Quard smiled indulgently, offered her a cigarette, which she refused, and lighted one for himself. "If I can't get you to play the woman's part," he said, spurting twin jets of smoke through his nostrils, "it's all up. Unless I can hitch up with someone else just like you." "You mean you want me to act?" "Right, the very first time out of the box. You know, it's this way with these cheap houses: they can't afford to pay much for a turn, even a good one. And this one of ours is going to be about as bum as any act that ever broke through. Take that from me. So it's up to me to find somebody who'll work with me for little enough money to leave something for myself, after I've squared up with the agent and stage hands, and all that. You make me now?" "Yes, but I haven't any experience." "That's just it. If you had, I couldn't afford you. But you gotta start sometime, and it won't do you no harm to get wise to what little I can teach you. Now the most I can count on dragging down for this act is $60 a week. I want 25 of that for myself. 15 more will fix the agent and the rest. That leaves 20 for you. It ain't much, but it's a long sight better than nothing." "But how do you know I can do it?" "That'll be all right. I know all about acting. Anyway, I know enough to show you how to put across anything you'll have to do in this piece. Now how about it?"
"Why, I'll be glad." "Good enough. Now here, I've had this dope typewritten, and here's your copy. Let's run through it now, and tonight you can start in learning. Tomorrow we'll have a rehearsal, and just as soon's we got our lines pat, we'll let Schneider have a pipe at it. Don't worry, it ain't going to be hard." Thus reassured, but still a trifle dubious, Joan accepted a duplicate of the manuscript, and composed herself to follow to the best of her ability Quard's second reading. This time he took less pains with his enunciation, scanned the lines more rapidly, and frequently interrupted himself in order to explain a trick of stagecraft or to detail with genuine gusto some bit of business which he counted upon to prove especially telling. In consequence of this exposition, Joan acquired a much clearer understanding of the nature of the sketch. It concerned two persons only: a remarkably successful stage dancer, to be played by Joan; her convict husband, fresh from the penitentiary, by Quard. Scene: the dressing room of the dancer. Time: just after the dancer's turn. Joan, discovered "on," informs the audience of her fortunate circumstances through the medium of a brief soliloquy. Enter Quard, shambling gait, convict pallor, etc., to inform her that she has been living in the lap of luxury during the 8 years that he has been serving time. "I'm going to have my share now." Comedy business. Humorously brutal attitude toward wife. Slangy description of prison life. "They'll simply eat that up." Quard. More comedy business involving a gratuitous box of property, cigars, and a cuspidor. Suddenly, and without shadow of excuse, husband accuses wife of infidelity. Indignant denials. Wife exhibits portrait of child born after commitment of husband, and of whose existence he has heretofore been ignorant. It was for him I fought my way to the top of the ladder. He has your eyes. Incontinently, husband experiences change of heart, kisses photograph, snuffles into cap crushed between hands, slavers over wife's hand, refuses her offer of assistance, announces he will go West "to make a man of myself," before returning to claim his wife and child. And the curtain falls upon him in the act of going out, all broken up. "Of course," Quard admitted, "it's bunk stuff, but we can put it across all right. I'm going to call it 'The Convict's Return,' and bill it as by Charles D'Arcy and Company. You'll be the company. I don't want to use my name, because it ain't going to do me any good to have it known I've taken to this graft, and if I'm lucky no one's going to spot me through my make up." Suddenly apprised by the failing light that the hour was growing late, he pocketed the manuscript and rose. "Come on out and eat. Business dinner. We'll talk things over, and I'll fetch you home early, so's you can start getting up on your lines." They dined again at the Italian boarding house. Quard drank, but sparingly, considerably to the relief of Joan. She was home by 8:30, her head buzzing with her efforts to remember all he had told her, and sat up till 3 in the morning, conning the inhuman speeches of her part until she had them by rote. No very wonderful accomplishment, considering that the sketch was to play less than 15 minutes, and that 2/3 of its lines were to be delivered by Quard. But once with head on pillow, it was not her rôle that she remembered, but the man: his coarsely musical tones, his eloquent white hands, the overt admiration that shone in his eyes whenever he forgot his sketch and remembered momentarily Joan the woman. She felt sure he liked her, and she liked him well. Of the merits of his enterprise she knew nothing, but he had succeeded in inspiring her with confidence that he knew what he was about. She drifted off into sleep, comforted by the conviction that she had found a friend. By the time of her return from breakfast, the next morning, Quard was waiting for her at the lodging house. He had already arranged with Madame Duprat for the use of the front parlour for rehearsals, pending its release to some fortuitous tenant, and here he proceeded to work out the physical action of the sketch. His gratitude to Joan for knowing her part was almost affecting. He himself was by no means familiar with his own, and her prompt response to cues he read from manuscript facilitated his task considerably. When they adjourned for luncheon he announced himself persuaded that they would be ready to open within a week. Within that period Joan learned many things. She was a tractable and docile student, keen set to profit by the scraps of dramatic chicanery which formed the major part of Quard's stage intelligence. He himself had a very fair memory and had been drilled by more than one competent stage director whose instructions had stuck in his mind, forming a valuable addition to his professional equipment. Joan soon learned to speak out clearly, to infuse some little semblance of human feeling into several of her turgid lines, to suffer herself to be dragged by one wrist round the room on her knees, by the romantical convict, to time her actions by mental counting, to feed lines to her partner in a rapid patter through the passages of putative comedy. She learned also to answer to "dearie" as to her given name, and to submit to being handled in a way she did not like, but which, from all that she could observe, was considered neither familiar nor objectionable as being people of the stage. And she learned, furthermore, that May Dean's opinion of the venture was never to be drawn beyond a mildly derisive "My God!" while Maisie's ran to the sense that it was all a chance and Joan a little fool if she didn't grab it. And anyway, Joan was old enough to take care of herself, with Charlie Quard or any man living. And it was Maisie who was responsible for insisting that Joan wheedle an advance of $10 from Quard, ostensibly toward the purchase of costume and make up. But when this had been successfully negotiated, the dancers advised Joan to save it against an emergency, and between them provided her with an outfit composed of cast-offs: a black satin décolleté bodice, an accordion pleated short skirt of the period of 1890, wear-proof silk stockings, a pair of broken down satin slippers with red heels, a japanned tin make-up box with a broken lock, and a generous supply of cheap grease paint and cold cream. Joan's début occurred within the time limit set by Quard and before an audience of two, not counting a few grinning stage hands. The two were the agent Schneider and the manager of a small moving picture house in the 23rd Street shopping district, on the half lighted stage of which their tryout took place at 10:30 of a rainy and disheartening morning. The judges sat in the darkened auditorium, staring apathetically and chewing large cigars. Joan, though a little self conscious, was not at all nervous, and remembered her lines perfectly. Better than this, she looked very fetching indeed in her makeshift costume. Quard forgot several of his speeches, floundered all over the stage, and in a frantic effort to redeem himself clowned his part outrageously. Nevertheless, they were engaged. Convinced of their failure, Joan had only succeeded in removing her make up and struggling into her shabby street clothing when Quard knocked at the door of her dressing room. He had played without make up and consequently had been able to catch the manager and agent before they could escape. Lounging in the doorway, he breathed a spirit of congratulation strongly tainted with fumes of whiskey. "We're on," he declared exultantly. "What'd I tell you? You needn't have changed, because we're going to stick here and open today. One of the turns on this week's bill fell down at the last minute, and so we caught this chance to fill in. We go on after the first films, about 1:15, and then at 4:30, 7:30, 10:45. Now, what do you know about that?" Joan gulped and shook her head, her eyes a little misty. For the first time she began to perceive that she had counted desperately on success. "I think we're awful lucky," she said faintly. "Lucky nothing! I knew I could get away with it, always providing I had you to play up to." "Me?" "That's right. After we'd fixed things up I took Schneider down to the corner and bought him a drink. He said I don't know as I ought to tell you this, but anyway, he said this sketch was punk. God knows it is, and never would have gone if it hadn't been for you. He said all the women would go crazy about you. You'd got the prettiest shape he'd seen in a month of Sundays. You know, they get most of their afternoon houses from the women shoppers down here." He paused and after a moment added meditatively: "Of course, you can't act for shucks." Joan looking down, said nothing. Quard dropped a hand intimately across her shoulder and infused a caressing note into his voice. "I guess I'm a little bad guesser, eh, dearie?" Joan stood motionless for an instant. His hand seemed as if afire, as if burning through her shirtwaist the flesh of her shoulder, and she resented passionately the intimacy of his tone. Of a sudden she shook his hand off and moved a pace or two away. "Let me alone," she said sullenly. Quard started and jerked out a "What?" "I said, 'Let me alone,'" she repeated in the same manner, looking him steadily in the face. He coloured darkly, mumbled something indistinguishable, and flashed into a short lived fit of temper. "What's the matter with you, anyway?" he demanded hotly. "Nothing," she replied quietly. "Only I don't want to be pawed." "No?" he exclaimed with sarcasm. "Is that straight?" "Yes, that's straight. And so am I." Recollecting himself, Quard attempted to carry off his discomfiture with a shrug and a laugh. "Oh, all right. Don't get huffy. I didn't mean anything." "I know you didn't. But don't do it again." He turned out into the corridor, hesitated. "Well, let it go at that, can't you?" "All right," she said sulkily. "You let it go at that." Quard tramped off without saying anything more, and whatever his resentment and disappointment, schooled himself to control them and met her half way to a reconciliation when the approaching hour of their first public appearance brought them together in the wings. And by this time Joan had been sufficiently diverted by other experiences to have regained her normal poise. The dingy, stuffy and evil smelling dressing room to which she had been assigned had suffered an invasion of three other women: two worn and haggard clog dancers and a matronly ballad singer who, having donned an excessively soiled but showy evening gown, had settled down calmly to her knitting, an occupation which had interfered not in the least with her flow of animated and not unkindly gossip. Joan gathered that her voice was the main support of a small family, consisting of a shiftless husband and three children, for the younger of them of whom the mother was knitting a pair of small pink bootees. These last had immediately enlisted the sympathetic interest of the clog dancers, one of whom boasted of the precocity of her only child, a boy of 8 living with his grandmother in Omaha, while the other told simply of the death of two children, due to neglect on the part of those to whom she had been obliged to entrust them while on the road. Joan was the first to reach the entrance to the dingy kitchen set which was to figure as a star dressing room for the purposes of their sketch, and for the purposes of subsequent offerings as the drawing room of a mansion on Fifth Avenue and the palm room of a fashionable hotel. About 10 times the size of any dressing room ever constructed, it was still atmospherically cheerless and depressing. She looked it over momentarily to make sure that the various simple properties were in place, and turned to find Quard approaching. Beneath the jaunty assurance which even his hang-dog make-up couldn't wholly disguise, she was able to detect traces of some uneasiness and anxiety. It was a fact that he had grown a trifle afraid of her. The discovery impressed her as so absurd that she smiled, and instantly the man was himself again. He thrust out a hand, to which, with covert reluctance, she entrusted her own. "All right now?" he asked cheerfully. She nodded. "All right." "Good enough. Let's see what kind of a house we've got." He found a peephole near the proscenium arch and peered intently through it for a moment or two, then beckoned Joan to take his place. But she could make but little of what seemed a dark well filled with flickering shadows. She turned away. "Only a handful out there," Quard assured her. "It's too early for much of a crowd. No good getting nervous about this bunch." "I'm not," she asserted quietly. And she wasn't, no less to her own surprise than to Quard's. She was conscious of no trace of the stage fright she had heard so much about. Indeed, a singular feeling of indifference and disappointment oppressed her. It was all so unlike what she had looked forward to as the setting for her first appearance in public. the dreary and tawdry atmosphere behind the scenes of the dilapidated little theatre, the weary and subdued accents in which her dressing room associates had discussed their offspring, the tinkle 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 wang of a painfully automatic piano in the orchestra pit, her own shabby second hand costume, the brutal grotesqueness of Quard's painted countenance at close range: these owned little in common with those anticipations roused by the glitter and glamour of that fleshy show on the New York theatre roof garden. She felt cheated. In perspective, even the stocking counter seemed less uninviting. A muffled outbreak of laughter and brief murmur of applause filtered through the curtain. The piano stopped with a crash. Quard nodded and, touching her elbow, urged her toward the entrance. "Film's finished. Ready and steady, old girl." "I'm all right," she said sullenly. "Don't you worry about me." She heard the curtain rise with a rustling, as of mighty wings penetrated by the shrill squeal of an ungreased block, held back a moment, and walked on, into a dazzling glare of footlights, conscious of no emotion whatever beyond desire to get finished with her part and return to the dressing room. At the designated spot, near the centre of the stage, she paused, faced the audience with her trained smile and mouthed the opening lines with precisely the proper intonation. The curtain fell at length amid a few scattering handclaps that sounded much like faint hearted firecrackers exploding at a distance. Joan rose from the chair in which she had been seated, in a posture simulating abandonment to tears of joy, and walked soberly off the stage, barely anticipating a few stage hands who rushed on to make the changes necessary for the next act. Quard was waiting for her. "Well," he said, "it didn't go so bad, did it?" "No," she agreed listlessly. "Anyhow, they didn't throw things at us." "No." She endeavoured to smile, with indifferent success. "I got a lot more laughs with that spittoon business than I thought I would," he continued thoughtfully as they turned back toward the dressing rooms. Joan made no reply, but when she stopped at the door of her dressing room, Quard added tentatively: "Anyway, it beats clerking in a department store, doesn't it?" With some hesitation she replied: "I don't know." Chapter 13. Of Joan Thursday by Louis Joseph Vance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Immediately after her second public appearance in The Convict's Return, Joan removed her makeup, changed to street dress, and scurried through the rain to a child's restaurant, not far from the theatre. In her excitement she had forgotten lunch, and she was now thoroughly hungry. But she lingered purposely over the meal, and even for some time after she had finished, preoccupied with self-dissection. She was, at last, an actress, but she was none the less singularly discontented. In a very brief time she had travelled a great way from the Joan Thursby of East 76th Street. A world of emotion and experience already disassociated them, but she seemed to have profited little by the journey. She felt sure that she had started the wrong way to prove her ability to act, and foreseeing nothing better than her present circumstances, she questioned gravely an inscrutable future. Instinctively she felt uneasy about this intimate daily relationship with Quard. She wasn't afraid of him, but she was a little afraid of herself, because she liked him. Though still she dwelt in secret longing upon the image, half real, half fanciful, of a lover gentle and strong and fine, such as one as John Matthias might prove. For all that, Charlie Quard had the power to stir her pulses with a casual look of admiration, or with some careless note of tenderness in his accents. The shower slashed viciously at the restaurant windows. At that hour there were few other patrons in the establishment, no lights to relieve the dismal grayness of the afternoon, and no sounds other than an infrequent clash of crockery, the muffled shuffling of waitresses' feet, and their subdued voices, the melancholy and incessant crepitation of the downpour. Joan was sensible to the approach of an exquisite despondency, and, in alarm, Fearing to think too deeply, she arose, ran back to the theatre and on impulse paid her way in through the front, to watch the flickering phantasmagoria of the flying films and to sit in judgment on the antics of her fellows on the variety bill. She was in no hurry to return to the dressing room, with its smells of grease paint, scented powder, ordinary perfumes, sweat, stale cigarette smoke, gin, and broken food. One of the clog dancers claimed a tubercular tendency, for which she asserted gin to be a sovereign specific, but as the day ran on was even forgetting, at times, to cough by way of an overture to recourse to the bottle. The other, viewing this proceeding with public disfavour, had opened up an apparently inexhaustible and hopelessly monotonous store of reminiscences of the privations she had endured in consequence of Fanny's weakness. Joan gathered that the two were forever being dropped from one bill after another because of Fanny's weakness. And of this she had 5 more days to anticipate and to endure. She crawled back to 45th Street at 11:30 that night, so dog-tired that she had neither the heart nor the strength to call on the Deans with her good news. This though there were sounds of discreet revelry audible through the door of the second floor front. Somehow the week wore out without misadventure. Joan walked through her part with increasing confidence. Quard left her very much to herself when they were off the stage. Indeed, he spent no more time in the theatre than was absolutely necessary. What he did out of it she did not know, but from the frequency with which he played his part with an alcoholic breath, she surmised that he was solacing himself in conventional manner for his degradation to the 4 a day. On the third day the clog dancers were dispensed with for the reason forecast, their place being taken by 2 female acrobats of a family troupe, who lolled about for 11 hours at a stretch in their grimy pink tights, and had little to say either to Joan or to the matronly lady with the robust voice and the knitting. But the change was a wholesome one for the dressing room. The following week Charles D'Arcy and Company played at another house of equal unpretentiousness, on the East Side, and the week after that was divided between 2 other theatres. And on Wednesday of the 4th week they were then in Harlem what Joan had vaguely foreseen and hoped against happened. Quard turned up in the morning with red-rimmed eyes, a flushed face and a thick tongue blatantly advertising a night of sleepless drunkenness. By sheer force of an admirable physique and the instinct of a trained actor, he contrived to play the first turn without mishap, snatched a little sleep in his dressing room, and seemed almost his everyday self at the next repetition. But after that he left the theatre to drug his jangling nerves with more whiskey, and appeared at the final repetition so stupefied that he would not have been permitted to go on the stage but for remissness on the part of the stage manager. Before he had been 5 minutes on view he was hooted off and the curtain was rung down amid an uproar. Once back in her dressing room, where she was alone, since their act was the last on the bill and the rest of the performers had already left the theatre, Joan gave way to a semi-hysterical tempest of tears. It was her first experience at close quarters with a man in hopeless intoxication, and while Quard's surrender was too abject to terrify, she was faint with disgust of him, and incensed beyond measure with him for having subjected her to those terrible 5 minutes before a howling audience. With this, she was poignantly aware that henceforth their offering was cold. By morning Quard's name would be upon the blacklist and further booking impossible to secure. She might as well count herself once more out of work, and now in even less hopeful circumstances than when first she had struck out for herself. For then she had been buoyed up by the fatuous confidence of complete inexperience, and then she had been comparatively affluent, in the possession of $22. Now she knew how desperately hard was the way she must climb, and she had less than $5. What little she had been able to set aside out of her weekly wage had gone to purchase some sorely needed supplements to her meagre wardrobe. It was some time before she could collect herself enough to dabble her swollen eyes with cold water, scrub off her make up and change for the street. She stole away presently across an empty and desolate stage and through the blind, black alley leading from the stage door to 125th Street. She felt somewhat relieved and comforted by the clean night air and the multitude of lights, the sense of normal life fluent in its accustomed, orderly channels. It seemed, in her excited fancy, like escaping from the foul, choking atmosphere of a madhouse. The theatre was near Third Avenue, toward which Joan hurried, meaning to board a southbound car and transfer to 42nd Street. But as she neared the corner she checked sharply, and, simple curiosity proving stronger than her impulse to fly across the street, went more slowly, only a few yards behind a figure that she knew too well, a swaying figure with weaving feet. Vastly different from the carefully overdressed, dandified person he had been at their first meeting, Quard stumbled on, his hands deep in pockets, head low between his shoulders, a straw hat jammed down over his eyes. Obviously he was without definite notion of either his whereabouts or his destination. Passers by gave him a wide berth. He seemed so broken and helpless that pity replaced horror and indignation in the heart of the girl. After all, he hadn't been unkind to her; but for him she would long since have gone to the wall. And ever since their clash on the day of the tryout he had treated her with a studied respect which had pleased her, apprehensive though she had remained of a renewal of his advances. Suddenly, and quite without premeditation, she darted forward and plucked Quard by the sleeve just as he was on the point of staggering through the swinging doors of a corner saloon. If her impulse had been at all articulate, she would have said that this was, in such extremity, the least she could do to try to save him from himself. "Charlie!" she cried. "No, Charlie! Don't be a fool!" The man halted and, turning, reeled against the door post. "Wha's the matter?" he asked thickly. Then recognition stirred in his bemused brain. "Why, is little Joan thirsty?" "Come away," she insisted nervously. "Don't be a fool. Don't go in there. Go home." He moved his head waggishly. "Thash where I'm goin'. Home. Soon's I brace up a bit." "Come away!" Joan repeated sharply, dragging at his cuff. "Do you hear? Come away! A walk'll straighten you out better'n anything else." "Walk, eh?" Quard lifted his chin and lurched away from the door post. "You wanna take a walk with me? All right." Indulgently: "I'll walk with you, little one, 's far's you like." "Come, then," she persisted. "Hurry. It's late." He yielded peaceably, with a sodden chuckle. But as he turned, the lights of the saloon illumined his face vividly for an instant and provided Joan with a fresh and appalling problem. The man had forgotten to remove his make up. His mouth and jaws were plastered with a coat of bluish grey paint, to suggest a week's growth of beard when viewed across footlights. There were wide blue rings round his eyes, and splashes of some silvery mixture on his dark hair. His face was a burlesque mask, so extravagant that it could not well escape observation in any steady light. It was impossible for Joan to be seen publicly with him, in a street car, for instance. But now that she had taken charge of him, she couldn't gain her own consent to abandon the man to the potentially fatal whims of his condition. For a moment, aghast and hesitant, in another she recognized how unavoidable was the necessity of adopting the suggestion his stupefied wits had twisted out of her pleadings. She would have to walk with him a little way, at least until he could recover to some slight extent. Indeed, even had she desired to, she would probably have found it difficult to get rid of him just then. For in an attempt to steady himself, Quard grasped her arm just above the elbow; and this grip he maintained firmly without Joan's daring to resent it openly. She was to that extent afraid of his drunkenness, afraid of his uncertain temper. Submissively, then, she piloted him to the south side of the street, where with fewer lighted shop windows there was consequently less publicity, and to Lexington Avenue, turning south and then west through the comparative obscurity of 124th Street. Neither spoke until they had traversed a considerable distance and turned south again on Lenox Avenue. The streets were quiet, peopled with few wayfarers, and these few hurried past them with brief, incurious glances, if not with that blind indifference which is largely characteristic of the people of New York. Quard suffered himself to be led with a docility as grateful as it had been unexpected. It was apparent to the girl that he was making, subconsciously at least, a strong effort to control his erratic feet. He retained her arm, however, until they were near 116th Street, when, noticing the lights of a corner drug store, the girl held back. A swift glance round about discovered nobody near. "Where's your handkerchief, Charlie?" she demanded. "Where's your wash, massa?" "I say," she repeated impatiently, "where's your handkerchief? Get it out and scrub some of that paint off your face. Do you hear? You look like a fool." "I'm a fool," Quard admitted gravely, fumbling through his pockets. "Well, I won't be seen with you looking like that. Hurry up!" Her peremptory accents roused him a little. He found his handkerchief and began laboriously and ineffectually to smear his face with it, with the sole result of spreading the colour instead of removing it. In this occupation he released her arm. With a testy exclamation Joan snatched the handkerchief from him and began to scour his cheeks and jaws, heedless whether he liked it or not. To this treatment he resigned himself without protest, with, in fact, almost ludicrous complacence, lowering his head and thrusting it forward as if eager for the scrubbing. For all her willingness she could accomplish little without cold cream. When at length she gave it up, his jowls were only a few shades lighter. She shrugged with despair and threw away the greasy handkerchief. "It's no use," she said. "It just won't come off. You'll have to go as you are." "What's that? Go where?" "Now listen, Charlie," she said imperatively. "See that drug store on the corner? You go in there and ask the man to give you something to straighten you out." Quard nodded solemnly, fixed the lighted show window with a steadfast glare, and repeated: "Something to straighten out. That's it. Go on, now. I'll wait here." He wagged a playful forefinger at her. "Mind you do," he mumbled, and wandered off. "And, Charlie, get him to let you wash your face," she called after the man. Waiting in the friendly shadow of a tree, she watched him anxiously through the window, saw him turn to the soda fountain and make his wants known to the clerk, who, with a nod of comprehension and a smile of contempt, began at once to juggle bottles and a glass. Singularly enough, it never occurred to the girl to seize this chance to escape. She was now accepting the situation without question or resentment. Quard seemed to her little better than an overgrown, irresponsible child, requiring no less care. Somebody had to serve him instead of his aberrant wits. To leave him to himself would be sheer inhumanity, but she reasoned about his case far less than she felt, and for the most part acted in obedience to simple instinct. She saw him drain a long draught of some whitish, foaming mixture, pay and reel out of the store. He had, of course, forgotten, if he had heard, her plea to remove the remainder of his make up. She was angry with him on that account, as angry as she might have been with a heedless youngster, but she did not let this appear. She moved quickly to his side. "Come on," she said quietly, turning southward. "You've got to walk a lot more." He checked, mumbled inarticulately, staring at her with glazed eyes, but in the end yielded passively. In silence they continued to 110th Street, Joan watching him furtively but narrowly. The drug worked more slowly than she had hoped. Primarily, in fact, it seemed only to thicken the cloud that befogged his wits. But by the time they had gained the last named street she noticed that he was beginning to walk with some little more confidence. He now seemed quite ignorant of her company, strode on without a word or glance aside. They crossed a central park, and, entering, began to thread a winding path up the wooded rises of its northwestern face. Momentarily, now, there was an increasing assurance apparent in the movements of the man. He trudged along steadily, but with evident effort, like one embarrassed by a heavy weariness. His breathing was quick and stertorous. The park seemed very quiet. Joan wondered at this until she remembered that it must have been nearly midnight when they stopped at the drug store. She had noticed idly that the clerk had interrupted preparations to close in order to wait on Quard. They met nobody afoot, not even a policeman, but here and there, upon benches protected by umbrageous foliage, figures were vaguely discernible. Men and women, a pair to a bench, sitting very near to one another when not locked in bold embraces. Joan heard their voices, gentle, murmurous, fond. These sights and sounds, the intimations they distilled, would at a previous time have moved the girl either to derision or to envy. Now she felt only a profoundly sympathetic compassion, new and strange to her, quite inexplicable. Near the top of the hill they found a bench set in the stark glare of an arc light, and therefore unoccupied. Upon this Quard threw himself, as if exhausted. He said nothing, seeming wholly oblivious of his companion. Immediately he was seated, his chin dropped forward on his chest, his hat fell off, his arms and legs dangled inertly. He appeared to sink at once into impregnable slumber. Yet Joan was somehow intuitively aware that he wasn't asleep. She herself was very weary, but she couldn't leave him now, at the mercy of any prowling vagabond of the park. Picking up his hat, she sat down beside him with it in her lap, glad of the chance to rest. She was at once and incongruously not sleepy and thoughtless. Convinced that Quard was coming to himself, she was no longer troubled by solicitude. Her wits wandered in a vast vacuity, sensitive only to dull impressions. She felt the immense hush that brooded over the park, a hush that was rendered emphatic by the muffled but audible and fast drumming of the man's overstimulated heart, straining its utmost to pump and cleanse away the toxic stuff in his blood. The infrequent rumble and grinding of a surface car on Central Park West seemed a little noise in comparison. Now and again a long thin line of glimmering car windows would wind snakily round the lofty curve of the elevated structure at 110th Street. Beyond, the great bulk of the unfinished cathedral on Morningside Heights loomed black against a broken sky of clouds. At one time a policeman passed them, strolling lazily, helmet in hand, while he mopped his brow. His stare was curious for the two silent and ill-assorted figures on the bench. Joan returned it with insolent and aggressive interest, as if to demand what business it was of his. He grinned indulgently and passed on. She had lost track of time entirely when Quard stirred, sighed, lifted his head and sat up with a gesture of deep despondency. The movement roused her from a dull, lethargic, waking dream. "Feeling better, Charlie?" she asked with assumed lightness. He nodded and groaned, without looking at her. "Able to go home yet?" "In a minute," he said drearily. "Where do you live?" she persisted. He waved a hand indifferently westward. "Over there, 96th Street." "Think you'll be able to walk it?" "Oh, I'm all right now." He groaned again, leaned forward, elbow on knee, forehead in his hand. "I feel like hell," he muttered. "The best thing for you is to get to bed and get some sleep," said the girl, stirring restlessly. He snapped crossly: "Wait a minute, can't you?" She subsided. "I guess you know I've gummed this thing all up, don't you?" he asked at length. "Yes, I guess you have," she replied, listless. "And of course," bitterly, "it's all my fault." To this she answered nothing. "Well, I'm sorry," he pursued in a sullen voice. "I guess I can't say any more'n that." She sighed. "I guess it can't be helped." He leaned back again, explored a pocket, brought to light a roll of money, with shaking hands stripped off 4 bills. "Well, anyway, there's your bit." Taking the bills, she examined them carefully. "That's a whole week," she said, surprised. "All right, it's coming to you." With neither thanks nor further protest, she put the money away in her pocketbook. "You've acted like a brick to me," he continued. "Don't let's talk about that now." "I don't want you should think I don't appreciate it. If it hadn't been for you I don't know when I'd have got home. Chances are not till tomorrow night, anyway." The old woman had been half crazy. Joan kept silence. "My mother," he amended, with a sidelong glance. "There's only the two of us." "Well," said the girl, rising, "if that's so, you'd better get home to her. She won't be any too happy until she sees you, and not then." Reluctantly he got to his feet. "She thinks I'm a great actor," he observed bitterly, "and I'm nothing but a damned drunken—" Joan interrupted roughly: "Ah, can that bunk! It'll keep till tomorrow. And maybe you'll mean it then." He subsided into silence, whether offended or penitent she never knew nor cared. She gave him his hat, avoiding his look, and without further speech they found their way out to the gate at 103rd Street. Here Joan paused to await an Eighth Avenue car. "You'd better walk all the way home, even if you don't feel like it," she advised Quard brusquely. "It won't do you any harm, and that mop of yours is a sight." "All right," he assented. He moved tentatively a foot or so away, checked, turned back. "I suppose this is good bye?" he said, offering his hand. "I guess it is," she agreed, without emotion. Barely touching his clammy and tremulous fingers, she hastily withdrew her own. A southbound car was swinging down to them, not a block distance. Quard eyed it with morose disfavour. "At that," he said suddenly, "maybe this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been so standoffish. I only wanted to be friends." In her exasperation Joan gave an excellent imitation of Miss Maydean's favourite ejaculation. "My God!" she said scornfully. "If you can't think of any better excuse for being a souse than to blame it on me, good night." The car pulled up for her. She climbed aboard, left him staring. Chapter 14. of Joan Thursday by Louis Joseph Vance. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Though it was after 3 in the morning when Joan got home, she wasn't, as she had thought to be, the only waking person in the house. She had no sooner entered than, fagged though she was, she grasped this knowledge with a thrilling heart. Beneath the door of the back parlour a thin yellow line of light shone, as brilliantly in the obscurity as the rim of a newly minted coin. She paused, and there came to her ears the swift staccato chattering of a typewriter. Of a sudden she remembered how long it was since John Matthias had been anything but an abstraction in the background of her consciousness. He might have been at home for days. She had neither known nor thought of him, so wrapped up had she been with the routine of her work and the formless intrigue of emotions stimulated by the personality of Charlie Quard. But now Charlie had eliminated himself from her life. She was quite sure that she would never see him again. While to the man labouring late behind that closed door she must be even more a dim reminiscence than ever before. It stung her pride to think that Matthias had been able to forget her so easily, and she regretted bitterly that she herself had been so ready to let the image of her absent minded benefactor fade upon the tablets of her memory. By way of mute apology and recompense, she hastened to enshrine anew, in her heart, her ideal of a gentleman, and it was fashioned in the likeness of John Matthias. And she resolved not to let another day pass without approaching him. She was sure he would help her if he could, and she was very anxious to make him realize her again. But morning found her in quite another humour, one as diffident as different. And promptly she made a discovery so infinitely dismaying that it put the man altogether out of her mind for the time being. The Deans, she learned, had on the previous day received an offer for an engagement at a summer park in the Middle West, and had accepted, packed up and departed, all in an afternoon. So she was more lonely than ever she had been since leaving home. The bedroom of the Dancing Deans, that salon where those stars of remote and lowly constellations had assembled to afford Joan her only glimpses of social life, was empty, swept and garnished. Those whom she had met there and who had been nice to her, those scatterbrained, kind hearted, shiftless denizens of the vaudeville half world, were only again removed from her reach. She spent that day and the next on the streets, trudging purposefully through the withering heat of August, once more a figure of the pageant which marches that most dolorous way, theatrical Broadway in the dog days. One with the groups of idling actors with their bluish jowls and shabby jauntiness, one with and yet aloof from that drift of inexplicable creatures of stunted bodies and shoddy finery, less women than children, wistful of man, with their strange foreign faces and predatory eyes, bold and appealing to men, defiant to women. Nothing came of it. The agencies took no more interest in her fortunes than they had before she could truthfully lay claim to stage experience. Each night she crawled home, faint with fatigue and the burden of the broiling day, to relish the bitter flavour of the truth that she would never go far without influence. The third day she spent at home, resting and furbishing up her wardrobe to make a good appearance in the evening. Toward nightfall she bathed, did up her hair in a new and attractive way, shrewdly refrained from dressing her face with rouge and powder after the fashion the Deans had taught her, and clothed herself simply and sweetly in her best skirt and a fresh shirtwaist, both recent purchases. In the deepening gloom of evening she mounted guard alone upon the stoop. Circumstances could not have proved more favourable, and since her eyes were quick to distinguish the tall and slender figure of Matthias the moment he turned out of Longacre Square, the length of the block away, she had ample time to prepare herself. And yet it was with growing consternation that she watched his approach, and when at last he ran lightly up the steps, she was so hampered by embarrassment that the words she had framed to address him went unuttered, and her tentative movement to rise was barely perceptible, a start, a sinking back. So that Matthias, in his preoccupation, received only a faint impression that he had somehow disturbed the girl, whoever she might be, and lifting his hat, murmured an inarticulate word of apology and brushed past her into the vestibule. As the door of the back parlour was noisily closed, tears of anger and mortification started to Joan's eyes. Then, promptly, temper overcame that which had daunted her calmer mood. Before she knew it, she was knocking at Matthias's door. He answered immediately and in person, with his coat off and his collar unfastened, by way of preparation for a long night's work. Staring blankly, he said "Oh?" in a mechanical and not at all encouraging manner. "Mr. Matthias," Joan began with a slight, determined nod. "Oh good evening," he stammered. Seeing him more at loss than herself, her self confidence returned in some measure. "You don't remember me, Mr. Matthias," she asserted with a cool smile. He shook his head slowly. "So sorry. I've got a shocking memory. It'll come back to me in a minute. Won't you come in?" Joan said "Thanks" in a low voice and entered. "I am Joan Thursday," she added with a hint of challenge in her voice and glance. "Oh, yes, Miss Thursday. Of course. Won't you sit down?" Matthias offered her an easy chair, but the girl was quite aware, as she accepted it, that he was still vainly racking his memory for some clue to the identity of Joan Thursday. "You were very kind to me one night about 6 weeks ago," she said, choosing her words carefully in order not to offend his fastidious taste. "Don't you remember? It was a rainy night, and I had nowhere to go, and you let me stay here." "Oh!" he exclaimed, his face lighting up. "Of course. I remember now. Joan Thursday, to be sure. You left me a little note of thanks. I've often wondered what became of you." "I've been living here, right in this house, ever since." "You don't mean it? How very odd! I should think we'd have met before this, if that's the case." "You've had plenty of chances," she laughed, feeling a little more at ease. She rested her head against the back of the chair and regarded him through half lowered lashes, conscious that the lamplight was doing full justice to her prettiness. "I've seen you dozens of times." "That's funny," he observed, genuinely perplexed. "I don't see how that could have happened." "You were always too busy thinking about something else to look at poor me," she returned, and then, intuitively sensitive to the affectation of the adjective "poor," a trick picked up from one of Maisie's women friends, she amended it hastily. "At me, I mean." "Well, I don't understand it, but I apologize for my rudeness, just the same." He laughed, and sat down, understanding that the girl wanted something and meant to stay until she got it, wondering what it could be, and a little annoyed to have his working time thus gratuitously interrupted. "So," he ventured, "you fixed things up to stop here, did you? At least, I seem to remember you weren't in very good form, financially, that night we met." "Yes," she said, "I fixed it up all right. I'd lost my money, but the next day I found it again, and I came back here because I didn't know where else to go. And besides there was my friends upstairs, the Deans, you know." "Oh, yes, to be sure. And did they help you find work on the stage? You did want to go on the stage, if I'm not mistaken." "Yes, that's why I left home, you know. But they didn't help me any. The Deans didn't, at least not exactly. Though it was through them I met a fellow who took me on for a vaudeville turn." "Why, that's splendid," said Matthias, affecting an enthusiasm which he hardly felt. "And you made good, eh?" "Well," she laughed a little consciously, "I guess I did make good. But he didn't. He was a boozer, and they threw us out of the bill last Wednesday." "That's too bad," said Matthias sympathetically. "I see." And truly he did begin to see. She was out of a job and wanted assistance to another. It wasn't the first time, nor yet merely the 100th, that he had been approached on a similar errand. People seemed to think that, simply because he wrote plays which, if produced at all, scored nothing more than indifferent successes at best, he could wheedle managers into providing berths for every sorry incompetent who caught the foot-like fever. It was very annoying. Not that he wouldn't be glad to place them all, given time and influence, but he had neither. Joan, watching him closely, saw his face darken, guessed cunningly the cause. And suddenly the buoyant assurance which had been hers up to this stage in their interview deserted her utterly. No longer enheartened by faith in the potency of her good looks and the appeal of her necessity, she became again the constrained and timid girl of unreasonable and inarticulate demands. After a brief silence Matthias looked up with a smile. "I don't suppose you have anything else in sight?" Joan shook her head. "And you need a job pretty hard, eh?" "Oh, I do!" she cried. "I haven't hardly any money, and the Deans have gone away, and the agencies won't pay any attention to me." "I understand," he interrupted. "Half a minute. I'll try to think of something." Unconsciously he began to pace the way his feet had worn from door to window. "How old are you?" he asked abruptly. She started and instinctively lied. "20?" His surprise was unconcealed. "Really?" She faltered unconvincing amendment. "Nearly." "No matter," he said briskly. "It comes to the same thing. You're under 20. The stage is no place for girls of your age. Don't you think you'd better chuck it, go home?" Not trusting herself to speak, she shook her head, her eyes misty with disappointment. "Besides, you're too good looking." Struck by her unresponsiveness, he paused to glance at her, and noted with consternation the glimmer of tears in her lashes. "Oh, I say, don't cry. We'll find something for you, never fear." "I'm sorry," she gulped. I didn't mean to. Only I can't go home, and I must find something to do. And you've been so kind to me once I thought " "And I will," he asserted heartily. "I'm only trying to advise you. I don't want to preach about the immorality of the theatre. A sensible girl is as safe on the legitimate stage as she would be in a business office. Safer." but theatrical work has other effects on one's moral fibre just as disastrous, in a way. It's lazy work. Barring rehearsals, you won't find yourself driven very hard, unless ambition drives you, and you've got uncommon ability and mean to get to the top. Otherwise, you won't have much to do, even if constantly engaged. You'll get average small parts. You may be on in one act out of 3 or 4. But even if you appear in every act, you'll only be in the theatre 3 hours or so a day. The rest of it you'll waste, 9 chances out of 10. You'll lie abed late, and once up it won't seem worth while starting anything before it's time to show up at the theatre. That's the real evil of stage life. To every hard-working actor, it turns out 100, 500, too lazy even to act their best, of no real use either to themselves or to the world. He checked and laughed in a deprecatory manner. "I didn't mean to speechify like this, but I do know what I'm talking about." Joan had listened, admiring Matthias intensely, but thoroughly skeptical of his counsel, to the tenor of which she paid just sufficient heed to perceive that doubts admitted would condemn her cause. "I mean to succeed," she said in an earnest voice. "I mean to work hard, and I do believe I'll make good, if I ever get a chance." "Then that's settled," assented Matthias promptly. "The thing to do now is to find out what you can do with a chance." He pawed the litter of papers on the table, and presently brought to light a typed manuscript in blue paper covers. "This," he said, rustling the leaves, "is the first act of a play we're going to put on early in September. It goes into rehearsal in a week or 10 days. There's a small part in the first act, a stenographer in a law office, a slangy, self sufficient girl you might be able to play. As I say, it's small, but it's quite important. It's the fashion nowadays, you know, to write pieces with small casts and no parts that aren't vital to the action. If you should bungle, it would ruin the first act and might kill the play. But I'm willing to try you out at rehearsals, with the distinct understanding that if you don't fit precisely, you'll be released and somebody else engaged who we're sure can play it." "That's all I ask," said the girl. "You're awful kind." "Nonsense. I'd rather have you than any one else I can think of just now, because you're pretty, and pretty women help a play a lot. And the man who's putting this piece on would rather have you because he'll get you for less money than he'd have to pay an actress of experience. So, if you make good, all hands will be pleased." "Shall I begin to study now?" Joan asked, offering to take the manuscript. "Not necessary. Your part will be given you when the first rehearsal is called. I merely want to refresh my memory, to see how much you'll have to do." He ran hastily through the pages. "As a thought, you are on at the opening for about 10 minutes, and near the end of the act for a 2-minute scene. 12 minutes' work a day, for, say, $25 a week. That isn't bad. You'll be out of the theatre by 9:30 every night. You see the point I've been trying to make?" "Yes," Joan assented. "It seems very easy. I hope I can do it." "I'm sure you can," said Matthias. "But how are you going to live between now and the opening?" Joan's eyes were blank. "Have you any money?" he insisted. Very little," she faltered. $18. "You won't get pay for rehearsals, and they'll last 3 weeks. After we open, it will be another week before the ghost walks. That's, say, 6 weeks you've got to scrape through somehow. $18 won't cover that. Perhaps you'd better go back to your old job until we start." "I was fired from the last, and it would take more than 2 weeks for me to find anything like it, I know." "And there you are!" Matthias tossed the manuscript back to the table, waved his hands eloquently and threw himself into a chair, regarding her with his whimsical, semi apologetic smile. "I'm afraid," he added after a minute, "I've reached the end of my string. Further suggestions will have to come from you." "I don't know," said the girl doubtfully. "Maybe I can think of something. Maybe something will turn up." "I hope so. Perhaps even I may invent something. If I do, I'll let you know, Miss Thursday." He arose, his manner an invitation to go, to which she couldn't be blind. She got up, moved slowly toward the door. "I hope I haven't bothered you much. Put you out of your writing?" "Oh, that's all right," he interrupted insincerely. "And you have been awful good to me." "Please don't think of it that way." He was holding the door for her, but on the threshold she hesitated. "Unless," she ventured half-heartedly, "unless I could help you some way with your work." "Help me?" he exclaimed, at once amazed and amused. "I mean copying, if you ever have any." "Typewriting?" She nodded, with a flush of hope. "When I was a kid I mean before I left school I studied a while at a business college nights, you know. They taught me typewriting by the Dutch system, but I couldn't seem to get the hang of shorthand, and so had to give it up and go to work in a store." "Now that is a helpful thought!" he cried, turning back into the room. "Wait a minute. There may be something in this. Let me think." But his deliberation was very brief. "It can be done," he announced in another moment. "I have got a lot of stuff to be copied. You see, about a month ago I " He checked, his eyes clouding without cause apparent to the girl. "Well," he went on, with a nervous laugh, "I didn't feel much like work. Guess I must have done too much of it for a while. Anyway, I found I had to quit, and went out of town for a while. Of course I couldn't stop work, really. A man can't, if he likes his job. And so I took some manuscripts along and revised them in longhand. Now they ought to be copied. I'd been thinking of sending them out to some public stenographer. But if you want the work, it's yours." Chapter 15 of Joan Thursday by Louis Joseph Vance. The Slipperbox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Never had any of her difficulties been adjusted in a manner more satisfactory to Joan. She rose at once from an abyss of discouragement to sunlit peaks of happiness. Installing a rented typewriting machine in the room adjoining her own, temporarily without a tenant and willingly loaned by Madame Duprat, she tapped away industriously from early morning till late at night, sedulously transcribing into clean typescript the mangled manuscripts given her by Matthias. By no means a rapid worker, after renewing acquaintance with the machine she made up for slowness by diligence and long hours. And the work interested her. She thought the plays magnificent, and a novel, which Matthias gave her when his stock of old plays ran low, she considered superb. It was his first and only book, and had not as yet been submitted to the mercies of a publisher. But to Joan it was something more than a book. It was a revelation, her primal introduction to the world of the intellect. From poring over its pages she grew hungry for more, thrilled by the discovery that she could find interest and pleasure in reading. She began to borrow extensively from the circulation branch of the public library in 42nd Street, and to read late into the night, defying the prejudices of Madame Duprat on the question of gas consumption. Refusing an offer of public stenographer rates, she had asked for $10 a week. This Matthias paid her, under protest that the work was worth more to him. The arrangement was, however, a fortunate one. For though at first Joan earned more than she received, after rehearsals of The Jade God had started she was seldom able to give more than 2 or 3 hours a day to the copying. These rehearsals furnished her with impressions vastly different from those garnered through her experience with The Convict's Return. The company assembled for the first time on a mid August morning in the author's study. There were present 8 men, aside from Matthias and the manager, his producing director and his press agent, and 4 women, including Joan. After brief introductions the gathering disposed itself to attention, and Matthias, rocking nervously in his revolving desk chair, read the play aloud. To most of those present the work was new and unfamiliar. They listened with intense interest, keenly alive to the possibilities of the various parts for which they had been cast. But Joan was not of these. She had typed all the parts and knew not only the story but her own slight, though significant rôle, as she would have said, backwards. Sitting in a shadowed corner, she devoted herself to studying those with whom her lines were to be cast. The leading lady was an actress who, after several attempts to star at the head of her own company, was reduced to playing second to the young and handsome matinee hero of several seasons ago, planning to return in triumph to the stage after an unsuccessful effort to retire from it into the contented estate of well financed matrimony. Through their widely published photographs, Joan was familiar with the features of both. She thought the star charming. Good humoured, good looking, well mannered, slight and graceful, he had all the assurance of a Charlie Quard and none of his vain swagger. But Joan decided on sight to detest the leading woman. She was a pale, ashen blonde, with a skin as colourless as snow, level dark brows, sharp blue eyes set close to the bridge of her pointed nose, and a thin lipped, violent mouth. The first impression she conveyed was one of dangerous temper; the second that she had been happy in her choice of photographers. Throughout the reading she sat negligently on the arm of a chair, swinging a foot and staring out of the window with an air of immitigable disdain. Of the other women, one was a grey haired, sweet faced lady of perhaps 50 years, whose eyes softened winningly whenever they encountered Joan's; the other an unlovely creature of middle age and long stage experience, who seemed to have no interest in life aside from her unfolding part. The remainder of the company, of a cast hallmarked by the theatre, offered nothing novel to Joan's eyes, aside from a fat, red faced lump of a youth, who was to act a thick witted, sentimental office boy in love with the stenographer, Joan. This one she decided to tolerate on suspicion. He resembled a type which she had found difficult, apt to impertinence and annoying attentions. Rideout, the man financially responsible for the production, was an English actor of reputation and considerable ability, carrying his stoutish body with an ease that almost suggested slenderness. With his plump, blowsy face, twinkling eyes and fat nose of a comedian, the insuppressible staginess of his gesture would have betrayed his calling anywhere. Now and again Joan surprised an anxious expression lurking beneath his humorous smile. She had inferred from some casual remark made by Matthias that Rideout was staking all he possessed on the success of this play. The producing manager, Wilbrow, was a short, lean bodied American, with lantern jaws, large, intent eyes, and a nervous frown. Joan was impressed with the aloof pleasantness of his manner. She was to know him better. The reading over, the company was dismissed with instructions to report at 10 the next morning, at an obscure dance hall masquerading under the name of an opera house, situate in the immediate neighbourhood between 8th and 9th Avenues. Several lingered to affix signatures to contracts, Joan of their number, and when these were gone there remained in conference the star, the leading woman, Matthias, Rideout, and Wilbrow. Going out to dinner that night, Joan passed Matthias bidding good bye to the leading woman in the hallway. He seemed tired and wore a harassed look; and later, when the girl delivered the outcome of her day's copying, he had a manner new to her, of weary brusqueness. The first rehearsal proper was held in a stuffy and ill ventilated room, so dark that it was necessary to use the electric lights even at high noon. The day was fortunately cool, otherwise the place had been insufferable. There was little attempt at acting. The company devoted itself, under Wilbrow's patient direction, to balking in the action. They had no stage, simply that bare foursquare room. Half a dozen chairs and a few long benches were dragged about to indicate entrances and properties. Nobody pretended to know his part, not even Joan, who knew hers perfectly. The example of the others, who merely mumbled from the manuscripts in their hands, made the girl fear to betray amateurishness by discovering too great an initial familiarity with her lines. So she, too, carried her script and read from it. When not thus engaged, she sat watching and noting down what was going on with eager attention. But she took away with her a depressing sense of having engaged in something formless and incoherent. But succeeding rehearsals, beginning with the second, corrected this misapprehension. That afternoon developed Wilbrow, suddenly into a mild-mannered, semi-apologetic, and humorous tyrant. He discovered an individual comprehension of what was required for the right development of the play, and an invincible determination to get it. He never lost either temper or patience, neither swore nor lifted his voice, but having indicated his desire, wrought patiently with its subject, sometimes for as long as an hour, until he had succeeded in satisfying it. He worked coatless, with his long black hair straggling down over his forehead and across his glasses. An incredibly thin, energetic, and efficient figure, dominated by a penetrating and masterful intelligence. Not infrequently, taking the typed part from the hands of one of his puppets, he would himself give a vivid sketch of its requirements through the medium of intonation, gesture, and action. And to Joan, at least, the effects he created by these means were as striking in the feminine rôles as in the masculine. Utterly devoid of self-consciousness, he had the faculty of seeming for the moment actually to be what he sought to suggest. One forgot the man, saw only what he had in mind. Another thing that surprised the girl more than a little was the docility with which her associates submitted to his dictation and even invited it. She had heard of actors "creating" rôles, but in this company no one but the producer seemed to be creating anything. The others came to rehearsals with minds so open that they seemed vacuous. Not one, whether the star, his leading woman, or any of their supporting players, indicated the least comprehension of what they were required to portray, or the slightest symptom of original conception. What Wilbrow told them, and then showed them how to do, they performed with varying degrees of success. So that Joan at last came to believe the best actors those most susceptible to domination, least capable of independent thought. As he gradually became acquainted with his lines and the business Wilbrow mapped out for him, the star began to give more compelling impersonations at each rehearsal. But to the girl he never seemed more than a carbon filament of a man, burning bright with incandescence only when impregnated with the fluid genius of a superior mentality. So, likewise, with the leading woman. As for herself, Joan was hardly happy in her endeavour to please. Having unwisely formed her own premature conception of her part, and lacking totally the technical ability to express it, she ran constantly afoul of Wilbrow's notions. She was called upon first to erase her own personality, next to forget the personality which she had meant to delineate, and finally to substitute for both these one which Wilbrow alone seemed able to see and understand. She strove patiently and without complaint, but in a stupefying welter of confusion. While on the pretended stage she was constantly terrified by Wilbrow's mild but predominant regard, which rendered her only awkward, witless, and ill at ease. Then, too, her attempts to imitate his brilliant and colourful acting were received with amusement, not always wholly silent, by the rest of the company. She seemed quite unable to follow his lead. And toward the end of the first week, throughout the whole of which she was aware from the calm resignation of Wilbrow's attitude she had improved not one whit, she began to despair. Inasmuch as she appeared only in the first act, she was customarily excused from attendance at the rest of each rehearsal, and spent this extra time at home, over her typewriter, thus maintaining the fiction of earning her weekly stipend. On Saturday afternoon, however, as soon as her bit had been rehearsed, there occurred one of those quiet, aloof conferences between Wilbrow, Rideout, and Matthias, which she had learned to recognize as presaging a change in the cast. Twice before, such consultations had resulted in the release of subordinate actors who had proved unequal to their parts. Now, from the author's uneasy and distressed eye, which alternately sought and avoided her, Joan divined that her own fate was being weighed in the balance, and her heart grew heavy with misgivings. None the less, she was permitted to leave with no other advice than that the rehearsals would resume on the following Monday, at 9 in the morning, on the stage of a Broadway theatre. She hurried home in a mood of wretched anxiety and creeping despair. Wilbrow had indisputable excuse for dissatisfaction with her. Rideout was quite humanly bent on getting the best material his money could purchase, and she was far from that, while Matthias couldn't reasonably protest against her dismissal for manifest incompetency. And dismissal now meant more to Joan than the loss of her coveted chance to appear in a first class production. It meant not only the loss of the living she earned as typist, and she had been engaged with the understanding, implicit if not explicit, that Matthias had only enough extra work to occupy her until the opening of his play. Dismissal from the cast of The Jade God, in short, meant the loss to her of Matthias. There was no longer in her heart any doubt that she loved him. The admiration conceived in her that first night, when he had turned himself out to afford her shelter, had needed only this brief period of propinquity to ripen into something infinitely more deep and strong. And from the first she had been ready and willing to adore his very shadow upon an excuse far less encouraging than his kindly though detached interest in her welfare. In her cosmos Matthias was a being as exotic as a Martian, his intelligence of an order that passed understanding, his thoughts and ways of speech, his interests and amusements, as far as she could define them, the delicacy of his perceptions, and the very refinements of his mode of life, all new and strange to her, invested him with a mystery as compelling to her imagination as the reticences of a strange and beautiful woman have for the mind of a young man. She worshipped him with a hopeless and inarticulate longing, and was content with this for the present, but hourly she dreamed of a day when through his aid she should have lifted herself to a position in which she would seem something more to him than a mere forlorn shop girl out of work and scratching for a living. If only she might hope to become an actress of recognized ability! It was a truism in her conception of life that the estate of actress was a lodestone for the hearts of men. If success were to be denied her! In her bedroom, behind a locked door, she hurried to her pillow and to tears. She had known many an hour darkened by the fugitive despairs of youth, but never until this day had she been so despondently sorry for herself. Later the banal ticking of her tin alarm clock penetrated her consciousness, and she remembered that she had work to do, to be finished before evening, if her promise to Matthias were to be kept. She rose, splashed face and eyes with cold water, and went to her typewriter in the adjoining room. She had really very little to do in order to complete her task, only a few pages of scored and interlined manuscript to reduce to clean copy. But her mind was not with her work. Time and again she found herself sitting with idle hands, thoughts far errant, and now and then she had to dry her eyes before she could proceed, so stubbornly did she cling to the sorry indulgence of self pity. Once, even, she was so overcome by contemplation of her sufferings that she bowed her head upon the table where the manuscript lay, and wept without restraint for several minutes, without restraint and, toward the last, with kindling interest, in the discovery that her tears were bedewing a freshly typed page. If Matthias were to notice, would he understand? And understanding, what would he think? With shamefaced reluctance she destroyed the blotched page and typed it anew. It was dark before she finished, and she was glad of this when she gathered up the manuscript to take to her employer. With no light in his room other than that of the reading lamp with the green shade, her stained and flushed cheeks and swollen eyes would escape detection. It was not that she wouldn't have welcomed sympathetic interest, but a glance in the mirror showed her she had wept too unrestrainedly not to have depreciated the chiefest asset of her charm, her prettiness. However, she could not well avoid the meeting. The work must be delivered, but if she were lucky she would find him in one of his frequent moods of abstraction, and their interview need only be of the briefest. Nevertheless she would have sent the work to him by the chambermaid if her week's wage had not been due that night. She waited a moment, listening at the door to the back parlour, but there was no sound of voices within, and reassured, she knocked. His response, "Come in," followed with unexpected promptness. She obeyed, though with misgivings amply justified as soon as she found herself in the room, which was, for once, well lighted, two gas jets on the chandelier supplementing the green shaded lamp. Matthias was bending over a kit bag on the couch, hastily packing enough clothing to tide him over Sunday. He threw her an indifferent glance and greeting over his shoulder. "Hello, Miss Thursday. I was beginning to wonder whether you'd forgotten me. I'm going to run down to Port Madison until Monday morning. Last chance I'll have for a day in the country for some time, probably. Chances are Wilbrow will keep us at work next Sunday. Got that script all ready?" Joan, depositing it on the table, murmured an affirmative in a voice uncontrollably unsteady. Before entering she had been quite sure of her ability to carry off the short interview without betraying her harrowed emotions. But to find the man about whom they centred packing to leave town, to leave her, added the final touch of misery to her mood. And the inflection of her response could not have failed to strike oddly on his hearing. Uttering a wondering "Hullo?" he straightened up and swung round to look at her. And a glance sufficed. His smile faded, was replaced by a pucker of sympathy between his brows. "Why, what's the trouble?" Joan averted her face. "Nothing," she faltered. Her lip trembled, her eyes filled anew. She dabbed at them with a wadded handkerchief. Matthias hesitated. He drew down the corners of his mouth, elevated his brows, and scratched a temple slowly with a meditative forefinger. Then he nodded sharply, and, crossing to the door, closed it. "Tell me about it," he said, coming back to the girl. "Things not going to suit you, eh?" She shook her head, looking away. I she stammered. "I can't act." "Oh, nonsense," he interrupted, with kindly impatience. "You mustn't get discouraged so easily. Naturally it comes hard at first, but you'll catch on. Everything of the sort takes time. I was saying the same thing to Wilbrow today." "Yes," she mumbled, gulping. I know. I was watching you. He and Mr. Rideout wanted to fire me, didn't they?" "What? Oh, no, no," Matthias lied unconvincingly. They were just wondering, I assured them." "But you hadn't any right to," the girl broke in passionately. "I can't act, and I know it. And you know it, as well as they do. I can't. I just can't. It's no use. I'm no good." Of a sudden she flopped into a chair, rested her head on arms folded on the table, and sobbed aloud. Matthias shook his head and, since she could not see him, permitted himself a gesture of impotent exasperation. This was really the devil of a note. Women were incomprehensible. You couldn't bank on 'em, ever. Here was he preparing to catch a train, and not too much time at that. But a glance at the clock reassured him slightly. He had still a little leeway. All the same, he didn't much relish the prospect of being compelled to invest his spare minutes in attempting to comfort a silly, emotional girl. And besides, somebody in the hallway might hear her sobbing. This last consideration took him somewhat reluctantly to her side. "There, there," he pleaded, intensely irritated by that feeling of helplessness which always afflicts man in the presence of a weeping woman, whether or not he has the right to comfort her. "There, don't cry, please, Miss Thursday. You're all right. Really you are. You're doing all this quite needlessly, I give you my word. You might as well have attempted to stem a mountain torrent." "I wish I could make you understand this is all quite unnecessary," he groaned. "I'm so miserable," came a wail from the huddled figure. "I'm sorry," he said uncomfortably. "Awfully sorry, truly. But I'm not afraid you won't make good, and I don't intend to let you go until you've had every chance in the world. That's a promise." He ventured to give her quaking shoulder a light, encouraging pat or two, and rested his hand upon the corner of the table. "Come now, brace up. Please, With a strangled sob, Joan sat up, caught his hand and carried it to her lips. Before he could recover from his astonishment, it was damp with her tears and kisses. Instantly he snatched it away. "You're so good to me!" she cried. Matthias, horrified, stepped back a pace or two, as if to insure himself against a repetition of her offence, and quite mechanically dried his hand with a handkerchief. And then, in a flash, he lost his temper. "What the devil do you mean by doing that to me?" he demanded harshly. "Look here, you stop this nonsense. I won't have it. Why, it's outrageous. What right have you got to do anything like that?" The shock of his anger brought the girl to her senses. Her tears ceased in an instant, as if automatically. She rose, mopping her face with her handkerchief, swallowed one last sob, and moved sullenly toward the door. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. You've been very kind to me. I forgot myself. I'm sorry." "Well," he said grudgingly, in his irritation. "But don't let it happen again." "There's no chance of that," the girl retorted with a brief lived flash of spirit. "Good night." "Good night," he returned. She was gone before he recovered, and then compunction smote him, and he followed her as far as the hallway. In the half light of the flickering gas jet he saw her only as a shadow slowly mounting the staircase, and a glance toward the front door discovered indistinct shapes of lodgers on the stoop. "Miss Thursday?" he called in a guarded voice. She heard, hesitated a single instant, then with quickened steps resumed the ascent. He called once again, but she refused to listen, and he returned to his study in a state of insensate rage, which, however, had this time himself for its sole object. Joan's transgression quite lost sight of in remorse for his brutality. He could not remember ever having spoken to any woman in such wise. No man had any right to speak to any woman in such a manner, for any cause, however exasperating. Tremendously disgusted with himself, and ashamed, he tramped the floor so long, trying to quiet his conscience, and made so many futile attempts to apologize to the girl by word of hand, one and all either too abject or too constrained, that he had lost his train before he produced the lame and halting effort with which he was at length fain to be content. A later train was bearing him under the East River to Long Island when Joan read his message. A servant had taken it to the girl's room and knocking without receiving an answer, concluded that Joan was out and slipped it under the door. When the descending footsteps were no longer audible, Joan rose from the bed, lighted the gas, and with blurred vision deciphered the lines. "Dear Miss Thursday, please forgive me for my unmannerly exhibition of temper. I regret exceedingly my inability to make you understand how sorry I am to have hurt your feelings. And do please understand that there is no grave dissatisfaction with your work at rehearsals. Remember that you have 2 weeks more in which to show what you can do. I shall hope that you are not too deeply offended to overlook my loss of temper and to continue typing my book. If possible, I'd like to have another chapter by Monday night. Sincerely yours, John Matthias. P.S. I enclose what I'd completely forgotten, the regular weekly amount, $10. She fell asleep at length with this note crushed between her pillow and her cheek. End of Chapter 15.